Hello, everyone. I'm Janani Ambikapathy, editor of Modern Poetry and Translation. Welcome to the digital launch of the latest issue of MPT, Salam to Gaza, with a focus on dissent and resistance. The beautiful cover image is by the artist Justin Moore. I'm very delighted to welcome our two contributors and readers, Jennifer Manoukian and Henri-Michel Yéré. Thank you for being here. The idea of the issue's focus came about as I was thinking about the various social movements of the last decade in Hong Kong, Chile, India, Iran, and many other places, and of course the necessity and the urgency of having to voice dissent as a genocide is unfolding in Gaza. A crucial aspect of voicing dissent is, of course, language. It is important to know what people are saying and the forms in which they're thinking about liberation outside the framework of English. As we're making connections between the various struggles across the globe, it's important not to gloss over the nuances, the subtleties, the complexities specific to each of these struggles. So I thought it best to ask the poets. In this issue, we have poems from Indonesia, Nepal, Timor-Leste, Iran, Côte d'Ivoire, Korea, Palestine, Hungary, and several other places and languages. And we are, of course, extremely lucky to have two contributors here with us today. Jennifer Manoukian has translated the poems of Missak Manouchian, an Armenian anti-fascist and poet. He's been translated and published in English for the very first time in this issue. So thank you, Jennifer. And I know that you went to some effort to find the original poems and translate them in a short span of time, so thank you. Henri-Michel Yéré's poems have been translated from French and Nouchi by Todd Fredson, who couldn't join us today. This is the first time Nouchi language has been featured in MPT. The poems are accepted from a book titled Polo Parle, or Polo Speaks. Henri-Michel will say more about that before his reading. Both readers will read poems in the original language and in English. This will be followed by a short question and answer. If you have a question in the course of the reading, feel free to pop it in the chat box. First, Jennifer. Jennifer Manoukian is a literary translator from Western Armenian and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California. Her research examines Ottoman Armenian social and intellectual history, particularly the history of language practices and ideologies. She earned her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2023 and is currently at work on a book project that explores the role of language purism in the making of Western Armenian in the 18th and 19th centuries. Jennifer, will you say a little bit about Missak Manouchian, his background, his anti-fascist activities, the book of poems, the only book of poems, and then follow it up with your reading?
Happily. So Missak Manouchian is a name that's more commonly heard and recognized in France these days. So in the Anglophone world, he's still in the United States and also in Britain, he's still sort of an unknown figure. He was born in 1906 into a rural life in South Central Turkey, so in a place called Adıyaman. He was 9 at the time of the Armenian genocide in 1915, and he was orphaned at that time. So it was a real cataclysmic moment in his life and in the life of Armenians more broadly. What happens with a lot of children who are orphaned during the genocide is that they are adopted, sometimes altruistically and sometimes not so much, by other families that weren't deported. So in the case of Manouchian, he was adopted altruistically into a Kurdish family. He lives with them for a couple of years. And after the First World War, many Armenian relief workers, with the support of the British, come through and they collect a lot of Armenian orphans who were living in these families, and they take them to Armenian orphanages, first in what's modern-day Turkey, and then to Lebanon. So he spends the late 1910s and 1920s in an orphanage in Lebanon. There he relearns Armenian, like a lot of other orphans do. He is schooled in the written Armenian that he then writes his poems in. Armenian is a diglossic language, so it's a language where the spoken varieties are really, really different from the written variety, what we call Western Armenian today. So he's apprenticed. He has a much beloved teacher who teaches him this register of Armenian. And in 1924, like many other Armenians, they make their way to France. He arrives in Marseille in 1924. He had trained as a carpenter in the orphanage. A lot of times these orphans were trained in really practical skills that would help them make a living. So he was trained as a carpenter. He works a lot of odd jobs, makes his way to France, but he's quite disillusioned with the clash between what he knew about France as this place of liberty and revolution and all of these beautiful ideals. It really clashes with what he sees as an immigrant in the 1920s. He loses his job pretty quickly after the Depression starts in 1929. And during his period of unemployment, he takes up poetry. He audits classes at the Sorbonne. And he starts writing the poems that you'll hear today and the others in his collection. He becomes a member of the French Communist Party in 1934, and he works on behalf of immigrant workers in France and in support of Soviet Armenia. So at this time, Armenia was a Soviet republic, and there were many communists in the diaspora, Armenian communists, who worked to build up this new republic. When the Second World War starts, he fights with a group of immigrant workers in France against the Nazi occupation. Because of this, he's targeted, and his face is plastered all over big cities and in a poster called the Affiche Rouge. Through that, he's captured and then very sadly meets his demise with many of his team in 1944. So his name became more widely heard in February of this year. He was entombed in the Pantheon, and he was honored as a French national hero because of the sacrifice that he made to France. So posthumously, his book of poems is published 2 years after his death, and that's what you'll be hearing today, two or three of these poems. So I will read the first one in Armenian, and I'll read the translation right after. This is a poem called Zerganka, deprivation. Փարեգամներ երբեմն ինձի կհարցնեն. Ինչպես կաբրիս, ու միշտ հոգվույթ խորհերեն գղծաս ուժ տալ հուսալքված սրդերուն. Մինչդեռ զրգյալ ու նոթի ես հաջախտուն. Երբ քաղաքի փողոցներուն մեջ թափար, թշվառության ու զրկանքին անհամար, հառաչանքներն ու փողոքներն անընդմեջ, աչքերովս կհավաքեմ հոգվույս մեջ. Ես սանոնք իմ դարաբանքին կխառնեմ, կբادرաստեմ ադելության թույներով, մի փառք շիճուկ. Որ գոհոսի զերդ արյուն, մարմնույս, հոգվույս, երագներուն մեջ համփուն. Քուցե հեղուգն այս անսովոր թվիցես, սակայն անզիս գոքևորե վակրի պես. Ադամներս ու փրունցքներս սեղմ ուժքին, երբ որ գանցնիմ փողոցներեն քաղաքին. Մարդիկ հաջախ զիս կգարձեն խենթ քինով. Մինչ երազանքիմը հույզերով, պաշարված են մտածումներս ինքնահոլով. Ու ես գերթամ հաղթանակին հավատքով. So the translation that follows, deprivation. Friends sometimes ask me, how is it that you can survive and always from the depths of your soul yearn to give strength to hearts in despair, when you yourself are so often deprived and hungry? When wandering along the city streets, I call on my eyes to collect in my soul the uninterrupted sighs and pleas of immeasurable misery and deprivation. I blend them with my own suffering. With the venoms of hate, I prepare a tart serum that flows like blood through all the veins of my body and soul. This liquid may perhaps seem strange to you, but it enlivens me, transforms me into a tiger. My teeth and fists tightly clenched, I pass through the city streets. People often think I'm crazy or drunk, while in the agitation of reverie, my thoughts are besieged, looping on their own, and I proceed with faith towards triumph. The second poem I'm going to read for you is called Ampochi Gancha, the call or the cry of the masses. Երբ սենյակիս առանցնության մեջ լրին, թղթին, քրին մդերմանամ սրդակին, ու սավարնի միտքս արձվիմը նման, անցյալին մեջ մարդկային լայն պատմության. Կամ ծերպազատ հոգի խայթեն թունավոր, ու ցանցրույթի ջիրաններեն արնաձոր. Ես կարփենամ երանության մեջ անհուն, քեղարվեստի խորհուրդներուն իմաստուն. Վայրի ուժեր հոգվույս վասկը կդարձնեմ. Թեբ իդեալ իր սանտրացակ արշավեն. Ու փրնորեն կփերեն զայն ներգայի, ամենօրյա բայկարին մեջ գադաղի. Ինձ կթվի, թե փողոցին մեջ մարդիկ կմարդնչին ժամանակին հետ սաստիկ, և ամեն բահ հաղթանակ է հաղթանակ, աբակային կբարձրանա մի փանակ. Մինչ ես հերու այդ բայկարեն սրբազան, կբախվդիմ խոխերու մեջ թավաջան. Արդ խրջահար, թուրս կվազեմ անցկորեն, ամփոխի հոգիս տալու ընդմիշտ ամփոխին. So, the cry of the masses. When, in the solitude of my room, a heartfelt intimacy grows between the silence, the paper, the writing, and me, and my mind soars like an eagle up into the past toward the expanse of human history. Or when no longer fettered by the venomous bite of worry, or by the blood-soaked clutches of tedium, I grow infinitely and blissfully intoxicated by the sage mysteries of art. Wild forces turn the course of my soul toward an ideal and away from its unbridled rush, forcibly bringing it into the frantic daily struggle of the present. It seems to me that people on the street are engaged in a fierce battle with time, and that at every moment, from triumph to triumph, they are raising an army for the future. All while I, far from that sacred struggle, hide out in my thoughts like a traitor. Now, my conscience stricken, I dart outside in anguish toward the masses to offer my soul to the masses once and for all. So for the sake of time, I'm going to read you just the English of a poem that we're going to talk about a little bit later. This is a poem called The Seamstresses, and Manouchian dedicates it to the Armenian seamstresses of Paris. This was a very common way for Armenian immigrants, particularly women who had no knowledge of French, to make a living. So it was very common for Armenian women in the 1920s and the 1930s and onwards to work as seamstresses to support themselves and their families. By the time the first glimmers of sunlight start rising, they are already sitting at their machines, sewing without interruption until the light fades into the bosom of the blessed night and the torpor of sleep comes. Orders are completed quickly, and the work must be neat and handed over to the boss, or else there'll be nothing the next day. And the fangs of deprivation look vicious from behind the curtain of misery. Their overlords, those scoundrels, want meticulous work. Under the ferocious lashes of exploitation, the seamstress, at times resisting the fatigue of exertion, at times yielding to it, trembles as she weighs her conscience against her bread. In a civilized city at a grand table, these women are slaves who toil all day long, as their lives drip away drop by drop, like cheap elixirs of life in goblets of debauchery and decadence. Sometimes old women fending for themselves, their hands already leathery, sometimes widows out of luck, confounded by life, and sometimes even young women, full of hopes and dreams still burning bright. They all toss their days into deprivation. Sacred work becomes a soul-sucking demon, from whom these drained, at times optionless women make every effort to flee. But he's caught them in his clutches, the clutches of daily life, where flights of desire are enslaved against their will. Whenever I see the boundless light in your eyes, light that grows dim and vanishes in exchange for some measly bread each day, oh, my sisters, my heart bleeds silently in my chest. I yearn to take away the exhaustion that weighs heavy on your shoulders. I clench my fists and grit my teeth. A rush of hatred and vengeance rips through my soul. Ah, fill me up with your torment. May the sacred flame of the struggle against exploitation never flicker out. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure listening to the poems in Armenian and for this like miraculous live BSL translation. Thank you, Haley and Audrey. It's quite something to also hear it in Armenian and also kind of watch Manouchian's poems being performed. Thank you very much. Andre, if you're ready, I'll read your bio and then you can say a little bit about the book, about the character of Polo, followed by your readings, and also about the bilingual, well, now trilingual nature of the book.
Right.
Henri-Michel Yéré is an Ivorian and Swiss poet born on 18 September 19. He has published 3 volumes of poetry. The first 2, 1990 and La Nuit était notre seule arme, was published in 2015. 1990 was shortlisted for Prix Côte 2016 and Prix Ivoire d'Expression Francophone in 2016. La Nuit était notre seule arme received a special mention from the jury of the Grand Prix National Bernard Dadier, the jeune écrivain, also in 2016. His third book, Polo Cuman, Polo Parle, was published in February 2023. It was shortlisted for the Adelphes Grand Prix Afrique 2023. It was awarded the Prix International Rotary and Pen Club de la Francophonie in October 2024. With a doctorate in contemporary history, Yéré studied in France, South Africa, and Switzerland. He lives in Basel, where he's a teacher and a researcher. He also works independently as a consultant on inclusion, equality, and diversity issues for cultural institutions, research establishments, and other companies. He is married with 3 children. Over to you, Henri.
Thank you so much, Janani. Good evening, good morning, everyone across the world who are listening to us tonight. Well, the book, of which we're about to hear some extracts, was written according to a principle that I imagined would make sense, because I came from the idea that I wanted to write poetry in a language that I feel carries a lot of poetry in it anyway, but that I had not seen yet exist in poetic form on paper. And that language is Nouchi. And Nouchi is the street language from Abidjan. It is a language that is composed of a lot of French, but which is a meeting point for the many languages that are spoken in the country. And the Ivory Coast is host to 60 ethnicities. So they are divided into 5 main linguistic groups. And so there are many different possibilities and permutations there, on top of the languages that are French, of course, which is the official language, the Côte d'Ivoire being a former French colony. And of course, the languages that are learned in school, such as English, Spanish, German, etc., all find their way into the street language that was born at the juncture of young people having to fend for a living off the streets because the school system could no longer cater to them. Having to develop some kind of a code in order to escape the authority of their bosses, in order to escape the authority of the state or that of the police, in order to be able to exist and to create their own world. So this is how Nouchi has developed in the 1970s, 1980s, mainly in the city of Abidjan. Abidjan is the main hub of the Ivory Coast. Abidjan hosts about 6 million inhabitants, and Côte d'Ivoire has a total of 30 million, just to give you a sense of how much of a cultural influence, economic influence, and political influence the city may carry. So Nouchi is heard on television, in TV series, locally produced, in music, locally produced. So it has an aura in West Africa, in French-speaking West Africa. It is characteristic of the Ivorian way of speaking French. And so I wanted to make that exist in poetry. And I wanted to give that poetry an existence in French as well, because a part of me wanted to make a point about the poeticity. I mean, I don't know if that is a word, of the Nouchi language, because I don't think that people in Côte d'Ivoire themselves take Nouchi as seriously as I take it, because they say, well, it's a fun, it's a very bouncy, very, very quick, you know, the next rumor on the life of some TV star can become a Nouchi word the next day. So it has this very quick, very pacey evolution, to the extent that what I have written in the book may already be outdated, considering that I've left the country a while ago. But I knew that as I was doing it, and I stand by that. And so the point I'm making is that I really wanted to make that poetry exist in French as well. And my original intention was to write it not in a French that you would hear, say, for instance, in Paris, but in a French as it is practiced in Côte d'Ivoire by people that refuse Nouchi, because why speak street language? If you're a high civil servant, if you're a university professor, why bother with this? Yet, even though you speak this language that you consider elite language, it has a local bent itself, which has become imperceptible, but which is very clear to my ear. And maybe that is the advantage of having lived abroad for a long time. In any case, I do not know whether I succeeded in that particular ambition. That was the ambition, at least. So this is how this book sort of came together. And Polo, whose name you hear in the title, Polo Kuman simply means to speak in Nouchi, which is a word that comes from the Jula language, which means to speak. And it's a Nouchi word for speaking. Polo is a young man born in Abidjan, who does not know his father, who's been raised by his mother, and who has limited prospect. And in the book, he enters into a conversation with his own future. And the future comes in and it's called demain in French and devant in Nouchi. And devant responds to him. And so it's some kind of a poetic jostle. And they sort of talk to each other, and they look for some form of resolution. So this is what the book is about. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to read in 2 poems, but it's going to be a bit of a procedure, and let me explain why. Because I'm going to be reading first in Nouchi, then the same text in French, and then in English. So so it may take a while, although it's only 2 poems. So bear with me. C'est dans la à côté là on est quitté pour bille papier. Comme Goudon daté coupé, on est découpé. Plus à secouer soleil pour déchirer nos cahiers. Nianfou de lignes sur feuille. Gasoil dit, il va allumer le ciel. Le nuage est blanc, on dirait Bambo. C'est de la marche qu'on est parti pour envahir le papier comme le goudron d'Atécoubé. Nous sommes morcelés. La pluie a tenté de toutes ses forces de déchirer nos cahiers. La ligne est floue sur la feuille. Le gasoil a déclaré la guerre au ciel. Le nuage est blanc comme une arme. It is from the margins that we left to invade the paper, like that paved route from Atekube. We are roughshod. The rain has done what it could to pulp our notebooks. The city's lines blur. Diesel has declared war on the sky. The cloud is white as a weapon. And I'm going to read you a second text. And whether we have time or not for more doesn't depend on me, of course. And in this text, if I may give you a little bit of context, Polo speaking directly to the future. Toi, on appelle devant là. Tu pas, on est des petits de Diallo, des fistines de Nita et de Boy, des petites Tina de Poi. Tu penses que nos bâillements, c'est pour chiens. Tu lances les flocons. C'est dans Tchapali on est né. On a gris-gras dans mots baissé. C'est dans Pampali on s'est debout. On est là, gâter le coin dans ta tête. Ta langue là, on a sabassa, fini. Demain, un jour, tu as décrété que nous étions des fils de boutiquiers, des fils de cuisiniers, de bonnes, de petites fantines, des boys. Tu crois que nos mots sont des aboiements? Tu t'avances trop. Levé du lit de la parole, les mots ont ouvert notre trouée. Le parler est notre péril. Nous voilà à danser dans ta tête. On sort ta langue de son palais.
I think we have time for one more cycle if you want to do one of the other shorter poems.
Thank you. Tomorrow, too quickly you decreed that we were sons of shopkeepers, sons of cooks, maids, little fantines, seasonal help. You think our words sound like barking? You're getting ahead of yourself. Lifted from the bed of speech, words have opened a way. The speaking remains our peril. Here we are, dancing in your head. Let's get your tongue out of that vaulted throne room. And I mean, I will take you up, Janani, on your generous offer. Thank you so much. Lave a pris place de sang. Les gars avaient pris mon cachat en s'amusement. Mon goquet m'avait déjà taillé. J'allais mettre la vie sans guébet. Gazon, en plein zinzin, on dirait visage de devant. Au milieu des six-tinchins, des balles de bao. C'est dans ça que je voulais mettre un jeu de jambes en mouvement. Au moment du nyarami, une bouée. Bien le nyara, ça fait longtemps que je guettais. Je remplaçais mon sang par la lave. Personne n'avait pris au sérieux ma salive. Ma fierté était plus haute que moi. Je venais déshabiller la vie. Les herbes, pleines de la folie des sèves, dessinaient le nom de demain. Au milieu des couteaux aiguisés, des balles qui brillent, j'aurais souhaité, en guise de balise, un acte improvisé. Pendant la noyade, une bouée ou enfin le combat tant redouté. I replaced my blood with lava. No one took my salivations seriously. My pride towered over me. I came to undress life. Chock full with madness sap, the herbs arranged the name of tomorrow. Amid the sharp knives and the shining bullets, I would have wished for a beacon, some improvised act, during the drowning, a boy, or even just to get right to it, that much feared clash. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for also reading the same poem 3 times in different languages. We very much appreciate the effort.
Okay.
Thank you. If there aren't any questions, I'm going to start with mine. Jennifer, I know that you're also a historian, and we also talked about kind of featuring maybe a picture of the seamstresses and the archival. Can you tell us a bit more about your archival historian's approach to translating Manouchian's poems, and also because his poems carve out a very specific time in history, and one of the poems in this issue, Those Deprived of Work, was written on the occasion of a protest. So can you just talk about the historian translator mode of working with Manouchian?
Sure. So I should start by saying that I didn't personally do archival work into the life of Manouchian. I relied a lot on a group of one historian in particular who works in Marseille. Her name is Houri Varjabedian, and she has done lots of digging into the traces that have remained of Manouchian in Armenian language journals that were published in France. So he published a lot of his prose work in a lot of these literary journals, which popped up in Paris and Marseille in the 1920s and 30s. And then after he was killed, his wife, who was also a resistance fighter, was concerned that his archive would be seized by the Gestapo. So she thought that the safest place would be to bring it to Armenia. And she did that in the 1940s, the mid-1940s. The difficult part was that at that time, a lot of Armenians weren't allowed to leave. So if you went to Soviet Armenia, you weren't allowed an exit visa. So she ended up, because of this drive, she ended up being forced to stay in Soviet Armenia for 18 years. And there is where his archive still lives. People can go and researchers can go and look through it. There's so many facets of his life to explore. So there's him as this poet, there's him as this political activist. And for me, I'm interested in language. I'm interested in the immediate aftermath of the Armenian genocide and what that did for Armenian language practices. So I'm very interested in his life in the orphanage and how he went from having lost Armenian, living with that Kurdish family, having adopted Kurdish as his own language for those years, and then being reintroduced to a spoken form of Armenian, and then the literary form that he wields in these poems. There are very few traces of I was going to say there are very few traces of spoken language. Spoken language and written language do overlap, but the way that he constructs his sentences shows that he was exposed to this formal language and that he made it his own.
Thank you. I do want to come back to the kind of diglossic nature of but before that, Andre, I was very intrigued by these two characters, Dema and Devan. Can you tell us a bit more about how are these conversations structured? I mean, I have some sense of it from having read excerpts from the book, but is it like a dramatic monologue, or do these characters speak back, or how did this come about? Can you tell us the interaction between these three, Polo and two sort of choruses in some way?
Well, it's interesting because Polo starts the book by sort of presenting himself in a way, by presenting facets of his life, and by making a case that apart from his ability to speak the way he does, he has nothing left for him to assert himself through this life. And then Demain or Devant comes in and says to him, "Are you crazy?" So he doesn't call for that. It's some kind of a spirit, a force that comes to him and says, "But why do you say that? I've known you ever since you were a child. And it reminds him of things that he's done that show how much of a courageous little guy he used to be, how he challenged his school teacher, how he stood to the bulldozers that came to crush the neighborhood, the shanty town in which he grew up, how he was able to escape that crushing almost miraculously, and how so he tries to tell him, but don't give up on yourself, because you seem to focus on what it is about you that you're not proud of, whereas I have seen you in moments of courage, of pride, of defiance, and I know that you still have that in you. But Polo doesn't understand that in the first place. He feels that Devant is disturbing him and is challenging him, so he responds as if he's being challenged by somebody who wants to fight against him. And in the end, they find a way to come together. But this isn't something that appears, because this isn't a narrative text. So they scream poems at each other, so to speak. And that sort of form of engagement, this narrative that I've spoke to you about, is something that one understands only towards the end. And it's interesting because as I was writing it, I did not start out imagining that this was what was going to happen. I heard those voices speak, and it took a certain time before I could see that they were actually speaking to each other. And it was a very gratifying realization, so to speak. So that is how they engage each other.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I also want to ask you about what languages they started speaking in, and then did they self-translate each other?
I can tell you. No, I mean the original texts are in Nouchi, because the original intention was to write poetry in Nouchi. But then I also realized that if I wrote it just in Nouchi, I would give a sense that I'm addressing a specific type of audience. And I don't think that I wanted to write just for an audience. I think every poet intends for their words to be shared with everyone, whichever language in which they engage. And so that's when I started to think about the different registers of language, of how French is practiced in Côte d'Ivoire. And I started to think about it in a way that I wasn't sure writers from my country thought about it necessarily. And so I wanted to, some do, I mean, because, you know how generations come up with their own concerns. And so you recognize each other and you see that you share a certain number of concerns with language, with forms of expression, etc. And so I was really quite concerned with that. And so for now, this is the way I have approached the issue, so to speak.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Jennifer, to go back to what you were saying about Manouchian having learned Armenian and then also having learned the diglossic, the literary version, and then sort of deploying it, that must have been an incredibly difficult process. And is the diglossic, what is his Armenian like? Is it because he's writing what I don't want to say, but I will say polemical poetry, that he's also speaking the protesters, etc. So how literary is it, or what is exactly the diglossic nature of this, and how did you work with it? And also, can you say a little bit about, I think, our mutually favorite poem, The Seamstresses?
Yeah, so this is a complicated language situation. There are more than just two, as Henri-Michel is talking about. I mean, language with register, and then the interaction of other languages of power that are non-Armenian languages. All of these things factor in, and it just makes you wish that you could talk to this person and ask him about his language choices many times. And this isn't just specific to Manouchian. Many times these don't seem like important questions to document. When someone is writing their memoir, they're not talking necessarily, they're not writing about these really personal choices that they're making and the social factors that that influence them. But in the poetry of Manouchian, you can see his, first of all, you don't see his everyday language. So Henri-Michel talked about the language of the street. Armenians also have a language of the street from the 1920s, and that's rarely ever used to write literature. So you have it through oral history sometimes. At this point, most of those dialects are extinct because people switched to the standard language. They switched to this formal language of writing that then later on in the century became a spoken language. So the very informal spoken language, we have very few written sources in them if it's not comedy or if it's not being written to be criticized. So we don't really know what his spoken language was like necessarily. Then the rung up is the language that he learned in the orphanage, which was this formal Western Armenian. And then above that, we have classical Armenian, which is a language that since the 5th century, when the Armenian alphabet was introduced, was used to write literature until the mid-19th. This is definitely not something that Manouchian would have learned in an orphanage. Classical Armenian is what priests learn. It's the language of the Armenian liturgy, and it's what scholars learn. So in the 1920s, he wasn't learning classical Armenian, but you do see classical flourishes in his poems. And this is likely because of the teacher that he had. And if you're including flourishes, you're including it to show that you are acquainted with this literary tradition, or you're trying to show that you're acquainted with the literary tradition that you are a writer to take seriously. So this is something that is impossible to convey in a translation without a footnote. So there's no way when you're reading the translation that you would know that the way that he declines a certain word, Armenian is a language with a case system. So the way that you decline a certain word is using the classical case ending as opposed to the modern case ending. It's something that I really love when I see it. It gives me a lot of insight into how they thought of themselves. But it's something that's it's really tough to convey that in English, which is a language without a case system and without a classical language to rely on.
Thank you. We have a question from Victoria Field for Henri-Michel. She thanks you both for the wonderful readings, and interested to know why Henri-Michel didn't translate his own poems into English, or what the benefits are of having another voice that is that of the translator engaged with the work. Yeah, I mean, this is the Devan, Devan, Polo, and then there's the translator also.
Right. Well, thank you for that question. I'm not sure that I can do justice to my own work if I were to translate it into English, because although I do have good English, English is a close second to my French due to my family history. We've spent some time living in an English-speaking country. I studied in South Africa, etc. I'm not certain that I would be capable of reading my own work with the eyes of a person who is used to dealing with the subtleties of language. Because translation isn't just about being capable of saying something in another language. It is a capacity to understand the variety of meanings that either a word or the structure of a phrase or a particular case conveys. And you know, it's like, so in my imagination, when you proceed to translate, it is starting out of the original language, you get onto a highway. And why do I use a highway metaphor? It is because a highway has several lanes. And so you get onto those lanes, and the choice you make of which lane you're going to adopt has an influence. This particularly true in poetry as opposed to prose. It's going to influence the rest of the text. And that decision is best left to somebody whose expertise it is to engage in these kinds of transaction, rather than me who wrote this, who knows all too well what I wanted to say, and who risks actually limiting the possibilities of what I was trying to convey, as a matter of fact, that I may not be aware of in the moment. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does.
So that is why I don't translate now into English.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And Jennifer, can you tell us a little bit about the seamstresses?
Sure. If you don't mind me turning the question back on you, Janani, would you tell me what you like about the seamstresses? And then I can tell you from the historical perspective why I find it significant. But just as a reader, what did you like about that poem?
Well, I kind of instinctually, that's one of my favorite poems in the set that you sent me. I mean, as soon as I read it, I knew that I kind of wanted to publish it. But I guess there's this kind of a strain of kind of subtle sympathy or empathy that kind of register that follows the anger. And in some lines, you can't really tell them apart. He's really sympathetic, and then there's also this rage and wanting vengeance, and he wants to avenge his sisters. And I thought that sort of the doubling of those emotions, which I really took to in this poem. Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite things. Yeah.
Yeah. You can almost tell that he knows a lot of seamstresses. He's done some ethnographic work. He's talked to people about what their pain points are. He's talked to them about what their daily struggles are like. It's also important from a historical perspective because we have, in Armenian history broadly, the writing of Armenian history typically leaves out the experiences of women, like so many historiographic traditions. So in the early years after immigration, we know very little about how people lived their lives day to day. So we could get a sense of, oh, this person is a shopkeeper, this person works in a factory, this person is a seamstress, fine. We get little glimmers, pictures here and there of people at work. But what did that really mean? The exploitation that we find in this poem is not something that comes through. The different generations of women that are doing this job that he mentions in one part doesn't come through in the historiography. So he gives value to these experiences, and he gives texture to these experiences in a way that we don't have in our history books. These women are very rarely seen in all of their diversity and all of the struggles that they have. Those are conveyed in this poem, and he ennobles them in a way that's sort of touching as a reader. And then he digs into these hidden struggles in a way that's really significant for the historian. A historian could come across this poem and write a master's thesis about Armenian seamstresses in Paris, something like that. It's an entry point, and it's done in what I think is a really beautiful way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think this poem and the other poem, there's like a kind of ethnographic strain as well to what he's saying. So in a way, maybe that sort of, he's a historian of his own time as much as he's a poet of the moment, which is quite an extraordinary thing to be. Henri, can you tell us a little bit more about the literary culture in French or Nouchi in Côte d'Ivoire, your peers, your contemporaries, and because I mean, Polo Speaks is quite I mean, from what I read, I think of it as quite an experimental text, in some sense. So is this kind of experimentalness a wider thing? Can you say more about the literary culture that surrounds this book?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking this question because, something quite interesting happened the year Polo Kuma came out is that other texts in the course of the year started to come out without us consulting each other, but knowing each other. Other texts came out that were written in Nouchi and in French. One of them being a long poem entirely with this, where this writer, Kapejik is his name, achieved what I was looking to do. He wrote it on a floor of ivory. A beautiful text. with quite a poetic title. It is not the thunder that rumbles, but it is our empty bellies that do. I mean, what a title.
Can you say his name again? Sorry, I missed the name of the poet.
His name is Capégic. And that book came out in French last year. And another poet from Côte d'Ivoire called Josué Guébo also wrote a text along the lines of the work that I did. And it was very interesting because we follow each other for many years now. As a matter of fact, he wrote the preface to my first book. He's older and more established a figure. And we've been thinking about the same things at the same time. So what you need to understand about Côte d'Ivoire is that it has a very lively slam poetry scene. And the slam poets are also keen to put pen to paper in the sense that they want to also they inspire themselves from the writings of Ivorian poets from the 1970s and the 1960s. And in the 1960s and 70s, it was mostly academics that would write poetry. So it's a certain type, a certain approach to poetry that was more classical, more following along the lines of the negritude tradition inspired by Aimé Césaire, by Léopold Senghor. But then in this generation where slam poetry became such an important phenomenon, there is much more, I find, daring. And there's a much more sort of a greater openness to the reality that there is such a thing as a way of practicing French that is profoundly influenced by the local context. And that is a reality out of which we would start. So this thing is taking place at the moment, not to a great extent, but to me, to a significant enough an extent, because it is fellow poets whose work I know and respect who are also taking this particular step. And I'm very, very honored to be part of that movement indeed. Somehow, the fact that it exists now in English is also, for me, it gives me, whether I like it or not, or my book at least, some kind of spearheading role in making this known to a wider audience. And I'm particularly pleased about that.
Yeah. Well, I know that Fredson working on a book-length translation of this, so I look forward to yours and translations of your contemporaries and peers. I think we should be wrapping up. I wish we could keep this conversation going, but thank you both. I really, really enjoyed speaking to you, and thank you for giving us a kind of wider context of your work, Manouchian's work, etc. And thank you, Audrey and Haley, for this extraordinary, I keep saying it, but it's quite amazing. I've never experienced BSL interpretation of poetry, so this is quite amazing. And I want to thank my colleagues, Ed, Sarah, and Debbie, who are here somewhere, for helping me put together my first issue, and our funders, the Arts Council, and all the audience members. Even though I can't see you, I hope I will see you at an offline MPT event in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.